Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Buckeye Politics. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the state of the election 4 days out. We're going to take a quick look at the presidential election as well as the competitive Senate races, and we're going to kind of just take a quick look at the polls, a quick look at the national popular vote. I'll kind of provide my take on what I think is going to happen and how the early vote's been going throughout the cycle. This is not a final prediction, just want to put that out there. I'll have a final prediction probably Sunday night or Monday morning with my actual final prediction for what I think will happen on Tuesday. But we're 4 days out. There's still a little bit that can change, but we're starting to get a better look at how the election's going to go. So I thought I would kind of just share the state of the race as of now. So looking at the national popular vote, Kamala Harris leads by about 1.2 nationwide. She is at 48%. Trump is at 46.8. This is actually closer than even just a few weeks ago, where Kamala Harris led by about 2 to 2.5, almost 3, a couple of polls in late September. So Trump has closed the gap in the national popular vote. As you can even see here, there's been a couple polls that have him up nationwide over Kamala Harris, although there's also been plenty of polls that have Kamala Harris leading nationwide. Usually they have her leading more than they have Trump up, like it's Trump plus 1, Trump plus 2. Well, most polls that have Kamala Harris up have her up by 2 to 4, although there's a couple that have her up by 1, 2, and even. So the national popular vote, I personally think that Kamala Harris will win the national popular vote by about a point and a half. I think the way it's at right now is going to be pretty accurate overall, although I think both Trump and Harris will do a little bit better. Like, I think Harris will probably be closer to 49. Trump will probably be at like 47 and a half, maybe closer to 48. We'll see. But I actually pretty much do expect the popular vote to go exactly how, maybe not exactly how the polls have it, but pretty close. So we'll start by looking at the part that actually matters, and that is the state-by-state results, starting in the state of Pennsylvania, which is not only the most competitive state, but also the most important. Out of the 7 states that are really competitive, Pennsylvania has the most electoral votes. If you look at the polls, as you can see, it is going back and forth, and it's been this way pretty much the entire cycle. Trump has a lead of 0.2 over Kamala Harris, according to the 538 aggregate, which is pretty insane. That's literally nothing. It's basically a tie. Anything within 1 is pretty much a tie when you look at try to compare all these different polls. But as you can see here, it's all over the place. You have Trump plus 2, Harris plus 2, Harris plus 3, even, Harris plus 4, even a Trump plus 6, a Trump plus 5, a Trump plus 3. So polling in Pennsylvania is all over the place. We really have no idea what's going to happen until Election Day. If you look at the early vote, I talked about this, I believe, the last video. The Republicans are doing much better than they were in 2020 in the early vote and 2022. The Democrats' firewall, as they called it, the amount of votes they needed to have already submitted by Election Day in order to beat the red wave that's going to happen on Election Day, because Republicans do tend to vote early. They're not hitting that firewall in terms of raw votes, which is not a good sign for Democrats, but then again, if a bunch of Democrats vote on Election Day, or Republicans just don't turn out, if the Republicans all vote early, then it doesn't really matter because they're not going to make up those votes on Election Day. But same thing for the Democrats. If they're not voting early, are they going to turn out to vote at all on Election Day? So there is still a lot up in the air in Pennsylvania. I still think, as of now, if I gun to my head, I think it tilts Republican very narrowly. I think it's probably going to be the closest state of the cycle, which is going to be kind of painful because it's also the most important state, but still that's where I think it stands. And then if we want to look at the Senate race in Pennsylvania very quickly, there is a pretty competitive Senate race there as well. David McCormick, the Republican nominee, is going up against the incumbent Bob Casey. Bob Casey is a fairly popular incumbent senator. He's been there for a couple different cycles. His father was a beloved politician in Pennsylvania. Bob Casey, he's well funded, he's well supported, and no one really thought this race would be all that competitive. However, David McCormick has ran a very strong campaign. Although you see here there's a bunch of polls that have Casey up by 6 or 7. Most of the polls have the race about relatively close. There's even a poll that has David McCormick up, but pretty much the aggregate has David McCormick down by about 2 to 3. I think that's probably going to be pretty accurate. I think David McCormick is probably down narrowly in Pennsylvania. I think if Trump has a great night and wins Pennsylvania by 2 to 3 points, he probably pulls David McCormick along with him. But as of now, I think Bob Casey is still the favorite. The state of Nevada, which is the least I guess, important state for electoral votes outside of Nebraska's 2nd district, which we'll get to in a second. But Nevada, 6 electoral votes, voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020, elected a Republican governor in 2022, but a Democrat senator. It's been back and forth in the polls. Trump does technically have a 0.4 lead over Kamala Harris in Nevada, but that's kind of being carried by 2 different polls that have him up by 6 and by 4. Outside of that, it's pretty much either Harris +1 or Trump +1. Nevada's a weird state politically. Things look very good for Republicans right now in terms of the early vote. They lead by, I believe, 44,000 statewide, which is pretty incredible, actually, especially because Nevada is a state that usually more people vote early than on election day by a lot. It's like 70% of votes are cast early, and Republicans lead there. But once again, the big question is, are these just Republicans who are voting early, or do Republicans still have a lot left in the tank to turn out on election day? If they do, then I see no reason Trump would lose Nevada. He probably wins Nevada by a pretty sizable margin. But if Republicans are turning out early and they're people who would normally vote on election day are just simply voting early, it's not new voters, it's not people who haven't voted in the past, and they're also not appealing to new people, then Kamala Harris probably takes Nevada. As of now, I'm going to keep it as tilt Democrat, although I could easily see it going to Donald Trump as well. Maybe that'll change in the final prediction once we see some final data on Sunday that will come out of Nevada. That'll probably influence my actual prediction. I think Nevada is going to be razor thin on the presidential level. On the Senate level, Sam Brown, who is the Republican challenger to Jackie Rosen, who is the incumbent Democrat, he's struggling a little bit. Polls had this race initially going very well for the Democrats, and the Republicans were really struggling, but it's gotten a little bit closer the last couple of days. I do think Sam Brown probably still loses by a lean margin, but once again, early vote looks very good for Republicans. If Sam Brown is able to appeal to a lot of these different voters, maybe some people that voted for Kamala Harris but are more conservative on other issues, and there's also the sympathy vote because he is an injured veteran. And like I said, the polls have tightened. So it's definitely possible Republicans flip Nevada, but as of now, I'd still keep it for Jackie Rosen. We'll go to Nebraska's 2nd district, if there's even a poll here, which I kind of doubt there is, honestly. I don't know if 538 actually does it like that, if we can even find it. If we can't find it, that's fine, because I don't even know if they have an aggregate for it, to be honest. Let's see, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Minnesota. It doesn't look like it. Okay, so 538 does not have aggregate for Nebraska's 2nd district. I'm putting it as lean Democrat, though. It's basically the city of Omaha and the suburbs. The polls have Trump getting crushed there, quite frankly. I think Kamala Harris leads by 8 to 10. I don't think that's actually what's going to happen. I think there's probably an oversampling of Democrats because, like I said, it is Omaha. But I do think that Kamala Harris probably wins it by a decent margin. Biden won it in 2020. Trump won it very narrowly in 2016. I think Democrats are favored there. So if we go back to the actual states, we go to the state of Wisconsin. Kamala Harris has a 0.8 point lead in Wisconsin. That's basically been what it's been. She's had a lead of less than a point basically since the beginning of October, end of September. Polling in Wisconsin is weird because it almost always way overestimates Democrats. I mean, Biden led here by 8 points in 2020. He won it by like 0.5. So Wisconsin is a state that polling almost always oversamples Democrats because there is a lot of voters, especially in rural Wisconsin, that are Trump supporters who don't answer polls. It's just a very difficult state to get a gauge for. The polling was relatively accurate in 2022, but Republicans are still, that's not really comparable to the presidential election. I would say that Trump probably is a slight favorite in Wisconsin at this point in time, despite what the polls say, just because if you look at past polling misses, whether it's 2016, 2020, Republicans always overperform by quite a bit. And like I said, midterms and presidential elections are just different. I wouldn't be totally shocked if Kamala Harris does win Wisconsin, but I do think it's also just demographically one of the easier states for Trump to flip. And also looking at the Senate race here, which is very interesting. Eric Hovde, the Republican challenger to Tammy Baldwin. This was another race that even just a few months ago, people thought Republicans had no chance in. Tammy Baldwin won by a pretty sizable margin in 2018. She led by about 7-8 points in the polls until like mid-September, when Eric Hovde surged and he's now within striking distance. There's been a couple of polls that have Tammy Baldwin up by a decent amount. It kind of looks like she surged a little bit, like the last day or so, but I wouldn't look too much into that. We really don't know what's going to happen. I would say that Tammy Baldwin is probably still a narrow favorite, but I would also not be surprised at all if this race did flip to the Republicans, because Eric Hovde at least appears to be a very solid candidate. In the state of Michigan, Kamala Harris leads by 1 point statewide. There were a couple polls that came out recently that had a Trump up statewide, so he kind of cut into that lead. But there's been others that have Kamala Harris up by 2 to 3. Michigan is another state that's kind of difficult to poll. There's a lot of different factors, such as the Arab American vote, if they're going to turn out for Kamala Harris, if they're going to vote for Jill Stein, how well Kamala Harris can do with union workers in places like Macomb County and the Detroit industrial area. These are voters who supported Trump in 2016, kind of regressed a little bit. Maybe Trump still won them, but they voted for Biden by a little bit more. And then it's going to be interesting to see how well Kamala Harris can do with those voters. A lot is still up in the air. Kamala Harris has been polling better in Michigan than in other swing states. Michigan is a bluer state than the other swing states. I think she's probably favored there very narrowly. Same thing with the Senate race. Mike Rogers is a solid candidate in Michigan, but polls really don't have... There's been a couple that have it kind of close, but overall, Alyssa Slotkin still has a sizable lead. I think if Trump wins Michigan by a decent margin, he can probably pull Mike Rogers over the finish line, but I think that this race is probably leaning to Alyssa Slotkin, the Democrat. So going down to the South, we'll go to North Carolina, which has Trump leading by 1.3 in the polls. Pretty much every poll outside of one or two outliers has Trump up in the state. Trump won the state both times in 2016 and 2020. Republicans have done fairly well in North Carolina pretty much the last 10 years or so, although it's still going to be very close. I think Republicans and Trump especially wins the state by about 1 to 2 points. It'll still be close, but it's pretty much a titanium lean R state. Yes, the margin is close, but Republicans are still favored nonetheless. So we'll put it as lean Republican. That pretty much matches with the polls, which have had Trump with a very narrow lead pretty much since the end of September. Looking at the state of Georgia, Trump has a 1.6 point lead there. Trump is almost at 49% in the aggregate, which is very interesting because Trump in Georgia, there's going to be Cornel West and Jill Stein are both on the ballot in Georgia. These are left-leaning candidates that'll probably take a little bit of votes away from Kamala Harris. So if Trump is getting 49% of the vote, it's very difficult for Kamala Harris to get 50 if she's also losing a little bit of votes to these third-party candidates. So the fact that Trump is polling not just ahead of Kamala Harris, but his margin is close to 49% is very good for him. If you look at the polls here, they pretty much all have Trump up narrowly. When was the last poll that had Kamala Harris leading? From about 2 weeks ago, they have Kamala Harris up by 1, which even then that's well within the margin of error. And that's also registered voters, which is not the best margin to do this close to an election. Because, if people, you want to use likely voters, because those are the people that are actually going to turn out. So I'm going to put Georgia as a lean Republican at this point in time, which that actually gives Trump the presidency, but we'll worry about that in a second. The state of Arizona, another interesting state that Republicans are doing fairly well in, if we can get to the polls in 538. This thing is going to work. Holy. All right, we'll have to go and just find it, I guess, because this thing is not working. Arizona. Okay. Trump leads in Arizona by about 2.2. He is also at 48.8, which is, again, very good. You want to be leading, but you also want to be leading by close to 50%, because with third-party candidates, it's going to be very difficult to make up that margin. Arizona is a state that polling in 2022 did very much overestimate Republicans. I mean, Carrie Lake looked like she was a lock to be governor, but she lost very narrowly. But Carrie Lake is also a much weaker candidate than Donald Trump. Republicans putting a lot less effort into the state in 2022 than they are now. And Trump also has held a much bigger lead in polling. I mean, Carrie Lake, the race was razor thin until the last 2 weeks or so when Carrie Lake had a huge surge. But Trump has led in Arizona the majority of the cycle. I mean, pretty much since middle of September, he's had at least a narrow lead, and it's only gotten bigger. The early vote in Arizona also looks very good for Republicans. If you look at the margins in like Maricopa County, Republicans are lead by like 100,000 votes. And obviously, not every registered Republican, especially in Arizona, which is known for having more moderate liberal Republicans, think like John McCain. Not all of them are going to vote for Trump, but I mean, there's not going to be that many defectors that it really hurts him. I think Arizona is probably tilting to Trump because I do think there is an interesting factor with the registered Republicans maybe voting for Kamala, and also the polling is a little bit less accurate in the state. I mean, even in 2020, Biden led here by about 2, 3, 4 points. He still won it, but it was by much less than that. So I would not discount a polling miss, but still, I mean, just like Georgia, things look very good for Trump in Arizona at this point in time. However, they don't look good for Kari Lake in the Senate race, if we can even find it on here, because Arizona, U.S. Senate, there is no graph, unfortunately, but Kari Lake has been really struggling. Her just approval as a candidate has been pretty bad ever since she lost the governor race. There's a lot of voters who just, even if they're like center-right Republicans, there's a lot of people who will vote for Donald Trump but not Kari Lake just because they view her as even more conservative, even more of, the stop the steal kind of candidate than they view Donald Trump. Kari Lake has also not ran that great of a campaign, to be honest. Ruben Gallego has outspent her by a lot and kind of shaped the narrative about her and her campaign. I think it's definitely possible she still wins, especially if Trump has a great night in Arizona, like the polls seem to be suggesting. But I just think it's very difficult for that to happen. I'm going to put that Arizona as lean Democrat. I think Ruben Gallego probably wins by 2 to 3 points. So the presidential map is already filled out. Trump is at 291 electoral votes. Kamala Harris is at 247. Still a very close election either way. You flip a couple of states either way, and it's a very different race. We'll finish off the Senate elections. The state of Montana, really not even competitive if we're being honest with each other. Tim Sheehy has maintained a pretty solid lead in the state over incumbent Democrat John Tester for the last few cycles. There was one poll that came out that had him up by just 3 points. Another poll had the race even, but that's a ton of undecideds and people voting for third-party candidates. And it's also just adults, which is not a good way to conduct polls. I didn't mean to do that. But I wouldn't even count this Montana state poll that has the race tied. But every other poll has Tim Sheehy leading pretty handily. Trump is going to win Montana by like 15, 16 points. I'll keep it as lean Republican just to be cautious, but I would not be surprised if Tim Sheehy wins it by 6, 7, 8 points, which would make it likely, but we'll keep it as lean for now. So the state of Ohio, that is the other Senate race I want to look at. According to 538, this is the most competitive Senate race in the country. It is also the most expensive Senate race in the country based off of money being spent. Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat, has about a 1.7 lead over Marino. Initially, things look very good for Bernie Moreno. Well, very early on, they look good for Sherrod Brown. Bernie Moreno seemed to surge a little bit in like the beginning of October. He was leading in a couple of polls. Sherrod Brown's lead was basically destroyed. But then the last couple days or so, there's been a couple polls that have Sherrod Brown leading and holding that narrow lead. This race is going to be very close. But Ohio polls almost always underestimate Republicans. If you look at the polls that have Trump matching his 2020 margin in Ohio, beating Kamala Harris by 8 points. They also have Bernie Moreno winning. It's the polls that have Trump doing worse in Ohio than 2020 that have Bernie Moreno losing. So it really depends on how well Trump does in the state. I'd be stunned if Trump does worse. I think worst case scenario, he matches his 2020 margin, which is enough to very narrowly pull Bernie Moreno over the hump. I'm going to put it as tilt Republican, just because, like I said, the data we're seeing is not looking bad for Republicans, but at least in the polls, it's razor thin. It could really go either way. But we're going to kind of count the polling misses as well as the Trump effect, because Ohio is a very Trumpian state. It's weird because Ohio is kind of like it's still very much a swing state. I mean, it votes for like left-wing like measures, but it still votes for Trump overwhelmingly at the presidential margin. So we'll see. Bernie Moreno could easily win by more. Sherrod Brown could easily win. I'd say it's pretty much a toss-up, but probably slightly favoring Bernie Moreno. So with that, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this quick little update, and I will see you in the next one.